The butter churn's rhythmic sloshing filled the quiet morning air as Priscilla Dalton pressed the wooden dasher up and down, her voice rising soft and sweet with the melody of amazing grace, humming each note like a prayer carried on the prairie wind. She had been at this since dawn broke over the Colorado mountains, sitting on the weathered porch of her family's modest farmhouse just outside our array, where the San Juan Range loomed purple and magnificent against the brightening sky. The year was 1882, and Priscilla had turned 19 just 3 weeks prior, marked only by her mother's apple pie and her father's rough kiss on her forehead before he rode out to check the cattle in the high pastures. Life on this hardscrabble farm meant every hand worked from sunup to sundown, and Priscilla's hands had grown strong from years of labor. Her fingers gripped the dasher handle with practiced ease, pushing and pulling while her mind wandered to the hymns her grandmother had taught her before consumption took her 5 winters back. The humming came natural as breathing now. It made the repetitive work bearable, turned the mundane into something almost sacred. Her voice carried clear in the mountain morning, notes pure and unwavering, filling the silence that stretched across the valley where their 100 acres sat nestled between rocky outcroppings and pine forests. She did not hear the horse approach until it was nearly at the fence line. Priscilla's eyes lifted, her humming faltering for just a moment before continuing, though her attention fixed on the rider who had stopped his dappled gray mare just beyond the split rail fence that marked their property. He sat tall in the saddle, hat pushed back enough that she could see dark hair and a face shadowed by several days of stubble. His clothes spoke of long miles, dust-covered and worn, but his posture held something gentle despite the weariness that seemed to hang about his shoulders. The cowboy did not speak at first. He simply sat there, listening, one hand resting on his saddle horn while his horse shifted beneath him. Priscilla felt her cheeks warm under his attention, but she kept her rhythm steady, kept humming because stopping now would feel like admitting something she was not ready to name. The butter would not make itself, and this stranger's presence would not stop the work that needed doing. When she reached the end of Amazing Grace and transitioned seamlessly into Rock of Ages, she heard him sigh, a sound so soft it might have been the wind if not for the way he leaned forward slightly, as though drawn closer by an invisible thread. Her hands never ceased their motion, though her heart had begun to beat a little faster. "Miss," he said finally, his voice rough from disuse but carrying a warmth that surprised her, "I hope you don't mind my stopping. I've been riding since yesterday afternoon, and I heard your humming from the road. It's the finest sound I've encountered in more miles than I care to count." Priscilla's humming stopped then, her lips pressing together as she regarded him with cautious blue eyes. Her father had warned her about strangers, about cowboys who drifted through town with silver tongues and empty promises. But something in this man's face spoke of honest exhaustion rather than cunning. "I don't mind," she said carefully, resuming her work though she kept silent now. The dasher moved up and down, cream slowly thickening into butter within the wooden churn. "Would you consider humming some more?" he asked, and there was no presumption in his tone, only a question posed with the kind of hope that comes from someone who has gone too long without beauty in their life. She studied him for a long moment. His eyes were brown, she noticed, warm like honey in sunlight. His hands looked capable, scarred from rope and leather and the 100 hazards that came with working cattle across open range. He wore no gun that she could see, though that meant little in this territory where violence could erupt as sudden as summer storms. "What's your name?" she asked instead of answering his question. "Gabriel Zimmerman," he replied, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture that was more reflex than conscious courtesy. "I'm passing through, heading north to hire on with one of the ranches up past Ridgway, or I was, until I heard you singing." "I was humming," she corrected. "Not singing." "Humming then," he allowed, and something that might have been a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Though I suspect your singing would be just as fine." Priscilla felt that warmth in her cheeks again. She was not accustomed to compliments from young men. Not out here where social occasions were few and far between, where most of the ranch hands who passed through were either too old or too rough for decent conversation. Gabriel Zimmerman looked to be perhaps 23 or 24, young enough to still carry some idealism in his eyes but old enough to have learned the hard lessons the frontier taught without mercy. "I suppose I could hum a bit more," she said, fighting to keep her voice level. "But only because you asked politely." She began again, choosing "Come thou fount of every blessing" this time, her voice rising sweet and true into the morning air. Gabriel closed his eyes, and she watched something in his face ease, some tension she had not fully registered until it released. He looked, in that moment, like a man who had found water after days in the desert. The butter thickened under her hands. She could feel it changing texture, hear the sound shift from sloshing liquid to the heavier thump of solidifying cream. Still she hummed, and still he listened, neither of them speaking, the moment stretching long and strange and somehow perfect in its simplicity. When her father's voice called from the barn, sharp with suspicion, the spell broke. "Priscilla, who's that at the fence?" She stopped humming immediately, sitting straighter as her father emerged from the barn, his expression hard in the way it got when he felt his family might be threatened. Patrick Dalton was a lean man, weathered by 50 hard years, his hair gone gray and his hands gnarled from a lifetime of labor. He carried his rifle with casual ease, not pointing it at Gabriel but making its presence known nonetheless. Gabriel straightened in his saddle, hands visible and open. "Sir, I meant no disrespect. I heard your daughter humming from the road and stopped to listen. I'll be on my way now." Patrick's eyes narrowed, taking in the tired horse, the worn clothes, the honest exhaustion in Gabriel's face. His rifle lowered slightly but did not disappear. "You looking for work?" The question surprised them both. Priscilla glanced at her father, trying to read his intentions. They had managed the farm alone since her brother Thomas had died 2 years back, kicked by a horse and gone before the doctor could even be fetched from town. Her father had aged 10 years in those 2, and she knew the work was getting to be too much for him, though he would never admit it. Gabriel seemed equally caught off guard. "I was heading north, sir, but I'm always open to honest work if it's being offered." "I don't pay much," Patrick said bluntly. "Room in the barn, 3 meals a day, and $1 a week if you work hard. I need help mending the north fence line, getting the fields ready for planting, and about 100 other things that need a young man's back." "I'll take it," Gabriel said without hesitation. Patrick grunted, something that might have been approval. "Put your horse in the second stall. Feed and water her, then come up to the house. My wife will have breakfast ready shortly, and you look like you could use a decent meal." Gabriel dismounted with practiced grace, leading his mare through the gate that Patrick opened. As he passed Priscilla on the porch, their eyes met briefly, and she felt something flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with exertion from churning butter. "Thank you for the humming, Miss Dalton," he said quietly. "Priscilla," she replied before she could think better of it. "You can call me Priscilla." His smile was quick and genuine. "Then you should call me Gabriel." He led his horse toward the barn, and Priscilla watched him go, her hand still resting on the churn dasher. Her father caught her looking and frowned. "Don't get ideas," he said gruffly. "He's just hired help." "I know, Papa," she replied, but she could not quite keep the lift from her voice. Her father shook his head and walked back toward the barn, muttering something about women and foolishness. Priscilla returned to her churning, but this time when she hummed, she found herself choosing the more joyful hymns, the ones that spoke of grace and new beginnings. The butter finished while Gabriel was still settling his horse. She carried the churn inside where her mother stood at the stove, frying eggs and salt pork in a cast iron skillet. Martha Dalton looked up at her daughter's entrance, taking in the flush in Priscilla's cheeks with a mother's knowing eye. "Your father hired that young man," Martha said, statement rather than question. "Yes, Mama. And you're pleased about it." Priscilla busied herself with working the butter, squeezing out the remaining buttermilk with wooden paddles. "I'm pleased Papa will have help. The work has been too much for him." Martha made a non-committal sound that suggested she heard everything her daughter had not said. She was a practical woman, Martha Dalton, worn thin by hard years, but still possessing a romantic streak she generally kept well hidden. She had been 19 herself when Patrick Dalton had courted her in Kansas, before they had loaded a wagon and headed west to seek their fortune in Colorado's mountain valleys. "Set another place at the table," Martha said finally, "and try to remember that pretty faces pass through often enough. It's what's beneath that matters." "Yes, Mama," Priscilla replied dutifully, though she could not help remembering the way Gabriel had closed his eyes when listening to her humming, the peace that had settled over his features. Breakfast was a quieter affair than usual. Gabriel sat at the table's far end, freshly washed from the pump outside, his hair still damp and combed back from his face. In the better light of the kitchen, Priscilla could see he was handsome in a lean, rangeland way, with high cheekbones and a straight nose that had been broken at least once. His hands, wrapped around a tin cup of coffee, were steady and strong. Patrick led grace before the meal, his voice gruff but sincere, and Priscilla noticed Gabriel bowing his head with genuine reverence rather than mere politeness. When they ate, he minded his manners, taking modest portions and thanking Martha for the food with obvious sincerity. "You said you were heading north to hire on with a ranch," Patrick said between bites of egg. "What made you willing to stop here?" Gabriel took a moment before answering, his eyes finding Priscilla's briefly before returning to her father. "Truthfully, sir, I've been drifting for a while now. Since my father passed last year, I've been working whatever ranches would have me, moving when the season changed or the work dried up. I suppose I'm tired of drifting. When you offered work, it felt like maybe a good place to light for a while." "Where are you from originally?" Martha asked, her tone gentler than her husband's. "Nebraska, madam. My father had a small spread near Ogallala. When he died, the bank took it for debts I didn't know he had accumulated. I've been on the move ever since, sending money back to my sister in town when I can. She married a shopkeeper, so she's settled at least." It was a common enough story in these times, Priscilla knew. The frontier made and broke fortunes with equal ease, and plenty of young men found themselves adrift when family circumstances changed. She found herself wanting to know more, wanting to understand what had shaped this quiet cowboy who listened to hymns like they were water in the desert. "The work here is hard," Patrick said bluntly, "but it's honest. I expect a full day's labor for your keep and wages, but I won't ask more than what's reasonable. We attend church in town on Sundays when weather permits. You're welcome to join us or stay here as you see fit." "I'd like to attend, sir, if it's all the same to you." Patrick nodded, something in his stern face easing slightly. He was a God-fearing man, Patrick Dalton, and he took the measure of other men partly by their relationship with the Almighty. After breakfast, the men went out to survey the work that needed doing. Priscilla helped her mother clean the dishes, trying not to watch through the window as Gabriel walked the fence line with her father, his long stride easy and confident. "He seems decent enough," Martha observed, following her daughter's gaze. I barely know him, Mama. But you'd like to. Priscilla did not bother denying it. Is that wrong? Martha dried a plate carefully before answering. No, sweet girl, it's not wrong, just be careful. We don't know much about him yet. Papa hired him. Your papa needs help badly enough that he's willing to take a chance. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be watchful. Priscilla nodded, accepting her mother's wisdom even as her heart continued its quick beating whenever she caught glimpses of Gabriel through the window. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that felt both strange and natural. Gabriel proved himself a capable worker, rising before dawn to help Patrick with the livestock before moving on to whatever task needed attention. He mended fence with efficient skill, his hands quick and sure with hammer and wire. He helped prepare the fields for spring planting, guiding the plow behind their ox with steady patience. He proved capable with horses, with carpentry, with the 100 small skills that made the difference between surviving and thriving on a frontier farm. And every morning when Priscilla sat on the porch churning butter, Gabriel found reasons to be nearby. He did not impose or presume. He simply worked within earshot, mending tack or chopping wood, whatever task allowed him to hear when she began to hum. And Priscilla, aware of his presence, found herself humming more than she ever had before, her voice rising clear and sweet into the mountain air. At first, her father watched this development with suspicion. But as the days passed and Gabriel continued to prove himself hardworking and respectful, Patrick's wariness eased. The young cowboy never shirked his duties, never gave cause for complaint, never did anything more forward than listen when Priscilla hummed her hymns. 2 weeks after Gabriel's arrival, Patrick went into town for supplies, taking Martha with him for a rare day away from the farm. Priscilla remained behind to tend the chickens and livestock, and Gabriel stayed to continue work on the barn roof that had developed a troublesome leak. Priscilla knew she should maintain propriety, should keep her distance with her parents away. But when she brought Gabriel a jar of cool water mid-morning, she found herself lingering longer than strictly necessary. He was on the barn roof, shirt sleeves rolled up, sweat dampening his collar despite the cool mountain air. When he saw her approaching with the water, he climbed down the ladder with the same easy grace she had noticed that first day. "Thank you," he said, accepting the jar and drinking deeply. "You didn't need to bring this out. You've been working since dawn," she replied. "Everyone needs water." They stood in awkward silence for a moment, neither quite knowing what to say now that they were alone without the buffer of her parents' presence. "I've been meaning to ask," Gabriel said finally. "Where did you learn all those hymns? I've traveled through a dozen towns and twice as many churches, but I've never heard anyone who knows as many as you seem to." Priscilla felt herself relax slightly at the question. "My grandmother taught me." She said music was prayer made audible, that humming a hymn was like sending up incense to heaven. Before she died, she made sure I knew every hymn in our book and then some. She taught you well. You have a gift, Priscilla. The way he said her name, gentle and reverent, made something warm bloom in her chest. "It's just humming." "No," he said firmly. "It's more than that. The first morning I heard you, I had been in the saddle for near 20 hours. I was so tired I could barely see straight, and I was beginning to wonder what I was doing with my life, why I kept drifting from place to place without purpose. Then I heard you humming, and it was like everything stopped. Like the world made sense again, just for those few minutes." Priscilla met his eyes, seeing honesty there that made her breath catch. "That's a lot of weight to put on simple hymns." "Maybe, but it's the truth." He paused, turning the empty jar in his hands. "I know I'm just hired help here. I know I've got no right to say things like this to you. But I want to be honest because pretending seems worse somehow." Ever since that first morning, I've been looking forward to hearing you hum the way some men look forward to Saturday night in town or Sunday morning in church. It's become the best part of my day." "Gabriel," she started, not sure what she meant to say, only knowing her heart was racing in a way that had nothing to do with fear. "You don't have to say anything," he continued quickly. "I just wanted you to know. And I wanted to ask if maybe, sometime when you have a moment, you might actually sing one of those hymns instead of just humming. I bet your singing voice is even more beautiful." She should have demurred, should have maintained proper distance, should have done any number of things that propriety demanded. Instead, she found herself smiling. "I'll think about it." His answering smile transformed his whole face, made him look younger and more hopeful than she had yet seen. "That's all I can ask." When her parents returned that evening, Priscilla said nothing about the conversation. But the next morning, when she sat down to churn butter, she sang instead of hummed. Her voice rose clear and true with the words to "How Great Thou Art," and from the barn where Gabriel was mucking stalls, she heard all work cease. She sang the whole hymn through, every verse, her voice carrying across the yard like a bell. When she finished, the silence stretched long and profound. Then she heard Gabriel resume his work, and somehow she knew that everything between them had changed. Spring deepened into the valley. The snows retreated up the mountain slopes, revealing new grass and wildflowers that carpeted the meadows in purple and gold. The days grew longer, the work more demanding as planting season arrived in earnest. Gabriel proved invaluable during this time, his strength and willingness making tasks that would have taken Patrick and Priscilla days of hard labor pass in mere hours. But it was the evenings that Priscilla treasured most. After supper, when the work was done and the sun hung low over the mountains, the family would sit on the porch in the cool air. Patrick would smoke his pipe, Martha would mend clothes, and Priscilla would shell peas or snap beans while the alpenglow painted the peaks pink and gold. Gabriel took to joining them, sitting on the porch steps with his back against the post, his long legs stretched out before him. He would tell stories sometimes, tales from his travels that made Patrick chuckle and Martha gasp at the dangers described. Other times, he would simply listen when Patrick spoke about farming techniques, or Martha shared news from town. And sometimes, when the mood struck, Priscilla would hum while she worked, and everyone would fall quiet to listen. It became understood without words that Gabriel was courting Priscilla, though he never did so openly enough to require Patrick's formal permission or rejection. He brought her wildflowers he found while working the far pastures. He fixed the step on the porch that had been loose since winter. He asked her opinion on small matters, treating her thoughts with respect that made her feel valued beyond her work. For her part, Priscilla found herself watching for him, listening for his voice, seeking him out with her eyes across the yard. She learned his habits, his preferences, the way his brow furrowed when he was concentrating on difficult work. She learned that he was patient with animals, kind to those weaker than himself, and possessed of a quiet faith that ran deeper than mere Sunday observance. 6 weeks after Gabriel's arrival, Patrick brought him into the house after evening work and poured them both a measure of whiskey, which was significant enough that Martha and Priscilla exchanged worried glances. "I've been watching you," Patrick said without preamble, "both with the work and with my daughter." Gabriel met the older man's eyes steadily. "Yes, sir. You've been respectful, which I appreciate. You've also been clear in your intentions, even if you haven't spoken them outright." "Sir, I would never presume without your permission." Patrick took a swallow of whiskey, considering. "You're a good worker, Gabriel. Best I've had since my son died. This place runs smoother with you here, but that's not enough reason to let you court Priscilla, and we both know it." No, sir, it's not. So tell me why I should. Gabriel glanced at Priscilla, who stood frozen by the kitchen table, her mother's hand on her shoulder. His expression was open, earnest, tinged with the kind of vulnerability that comes when a man lays his heart bare. Because I love her, he said simply. I know it's been only weeks, and I know I have little to offer beyond strong hands and willing heart. But I love her, sir. I love her kindness and her faith. I love the way she finds joy in simple work, the way she hums hymns like they're part of her breathing. I love that she's strong and capable and never complains about the hard lot she's been given. I love her enough that I'll leave if you ask me to, even though it'll hurt more than anything else I've endured. The silence that followed felt enormous. Patrick stared at Gabriel, his weathered face unreadable. Martha's hand tightened on Priscilla's shoulder. Priscilla herself could hardly breathe, her heart hammering against her ribs. Priscilla, Patrick said finally, not taking his eyes off Gabriel, do you return his feelings? Yes, Papa, she whispered, then stronger. Yes, I do. Patrick drained his whiskey. Then I suppose I should give my blessing before you young people do something foolish without it. The relief that flooded Gabriel's face was so profound that Priscilla felt tears sting her eyes. He stood, extending his hand to Patrick with formal gravity. Thank you, sir. I promise you won't regret this. I'll work hard, save every penny I can. I'll build us a future worthy of her. Patrick shook his hand firmly. See that you do, and Gabriel. You hurt her, and frontier justice will seem gentle compared to what I'll do. I understand, sir, and I promise you I would rather die than cause her pain. Martha was crying now, happy tears that she wiped away with her apron. She hugged Priscilla tightly, whispering something about prayers being answered in unexpected ways. Priscilla hardly heard her, too focused on Gabriel, who had crossed the room and taken her hands in his. I meant every word, he said quietly, just for her. I love you, Priscilla. I want to spend my life hearing you hum hymns, watching you find grace in every day, building something real and lasting with you. I love you too, she replied, her voice trembling with emotion. I think I have since that first morning when you stopped to listen. He raised her hands to his lips, kissing her knuckles with tender reverence. It was the first time he had kissed any part of her, and the gentleness of it made her breath catch. That night, lying in her small room under the eaves, Priscilla stared at the ceiling and marveled at how quickly life could change. 2 months ago, she had been resigned to the narrow confines of her existence, content but not truly happy, going through the motions of survival without hope for anything more. Now her future stretched bright and full of possibility, anchored by the love of a good man who had appeared as suddenly as summer rain. She hummed quietly to herself, too happy for sleep, sending up prayers of gratitude into the darkness. The courtship that followed was proper but warm, conducted under her parents' watchful eyes but with their blessing. Gabriel and Priscilla took walks in the evening, following the creek that ran through their property, talking about everything and nothing. They made plans for the future, practical discussions about where they would live and how they would manage, interspersed with moments of laughter and shy affection. Gabriel proved himself good with words when he wanted to be, expressing himself with an eloquence that surprised Priscilla. He wrote her letters even though they lived on the same property, little notes left where she would find them, tucked into the butter churn or beneath her sewing basket. They were simple declarations of affection, observations about her grace or kindness, promises about the future he wanted to build with her. She kept everyone, pressing them between the pages of her grandmother's hymnal. As summer approached, Gabriel spoke to Patrick about wages. He had been saving his $1 a week religiously, and now he asked to be paid in advance for the rest of the season's work. Patrick, understanding his intention, agreed. Gabriel rode into our array the next day and returned with a small ring, silver with a tiny chip of turquoise set in its center. It was modest but beautiful, the blue stone catching the light like a piece of captured sky. He proposed formally that evening, kneeling on the porch where he had first heard her humming, asking in a voice that shook slightly if she would do him the honor of becoming his wife. Priscilla said yes through happy tears, sliding the ring onto her finger where it fit perfectly. They were married in August, in the small church in our array where the Daltons worshipped. It was a simple ceremony, attended by the handful of families who constituted their small community. Priscilla wore a dress Martha had been sewing in secret for weeks, white cotton with lace at the collar that had belonged to her own mother. Gabriel wore his best clothes, brushed and cleaned until they looked almost new, his dark hair combed back and his face shaved smooth. When the preacher asked him to speak his vows, Gabriel's voice rang clear and firm. When Priscilla spoke hers, tears running down her cheeks, she meant every word with all her heart. At the wedding dinner that followed, held in the church hall with food provided by the entire community, someone called for the bride to sing. Priscilla blushed and protested, but Gabriel took her hand and encouraged her gently. So she sang, standing beside her new husband, her voice rising pure and sweet with amazing grace. When she finished, there was hardly a dry eye in the room. That night, they returned to the farm where Patrick had converted the small addition off the house into a separate living space for the newlyweds. It was tiny, barely large enough for a bed and a small table, but it was theirs. Gabriel carried Priscilla across the threshold, both of them laughing at the tradition, and set her down gently in the lamplight. "Hello, Mrs. Zimmerman," he said softly. "Hello, Mr. Zimmerman," she replied, her hands coming up to frame his face. He kissed her then, really kissed her for the first time, gentle but thorough, his arms wrapping around her waist. Priscilla melted into him, marveling at the feeling of being held, being cherished, being loved so completely. "I want to hear you hum forever," Gabriel whispered against her hair. "Every morning for the rest of our lives." "That can be arranged," she replied, smiling against his chest. They began their married life with joy and hope, two young people determined to build something lasting in the wild Colorado mountains. Gabriel continued working the farm with Patrick, but now he did so as family rather than hired help, with a stake in the land's success. Patrick, seeing how hard Gabriel worked and how happy Priscilla was, began teaching him the finer points of farm management, passing on knowledge accumulated over decades. The first winter was hard, as all winters were in the high country. Snow piled deep, and the temperatures dropped until water froze solid in its buckets overnight. But in their small room, with Gabriel's arms around her and his breath warm against her neck, Priscilla felt nothing but contentment. They would lie awake talking for hours, making plans for the spring, for the years ahead, for the children they hoped to have. "What should we name our first son?" Gabriel asked one frozen January night. "You're so certain it will be a son." "Just hoping." "Though a daughter who looked like you would be just as wonderful." Priscilla turned in his arms to face him, their noses nearly touching in the darkness. "My father's name is Patrick. My brother who died was Thomas." "Thomas Patrick Zimmerman," Gabriel tried out. "That has a good sound to it." "What about your family names?" "My father was John. His father was Gabriel, which is where I got my name. My sister is called Anne." "Anne is pretty." "It is," he agreed. "But I think our first daughter should be called Grace, like the hymn that brought me to you." Priscilla felt tears prick her eyes at the sentiment. She kissed him softly, wordlessly, Full of love for this man who understood her so deeply, spring came again, and with it the news that Priscilla was expecting. The pregnancy was easy enough, though the work did not stop for her condition. She continued her chores as long as she was able, humming all the while, her hands on her growing belly. Gabriel treated her like spun glass, constantly worried she was doing too much, though she laughed at his concern. "Women have been having babies since Eve," she reminded him. "I'm strong enough for this." "I know you are," he replied, his hand joining hers on her belly. "But let me worry anyway. It's a husband's privilege." In November, as the first snows began to fall, Priscilla went into labor. The birth was long and difficult, as first births often were, attended by Martha and the midwife from town. Gabriel wore a path in the kitchen floor with his pacing, Patrick sitting silently and smoking pipe after pipe while the women worked. When the baby's cry finally rang out, sharp and indignant, Gabriel nearly fell to his knees with relief. "You have a son," Martha announced, opening the bedroom door with tears on her face. "A healthy boy, and Priscilla is fine." Gabriel rushed past her to find his wife exhausted but glowing, cradling a red-faced bundle in her arms. The baby was perfect, tiny and wrinkled but already showing signs of his father's dark hair. "Thomas," Priscilla said softly. "Thomas Patrick Zimmerman." Gabriel sat carefully on the edge of the bed, his finger touching the baby's impossibly small hand. Thomas gripped it instinctively, and Gabriel felt his heart expand in a way he had not known was possible. "He's perfect," Gabriel whispered. "You're perfect. I love you so much." "I love you too," Priscilla replied, leaning against his shoulder. "We did good work here." He laughed through tears, pressing a kiss to her temple. "The best work we'll ever do." The years that followed were full in the way that makes life rich. Thomas grew into a sturdy boy with his father's eyes and his mother's gentle spirit. 2 years after his birth, a daughter arrived, and they named her Grace as planned. She had her mother's blonde hair and her father's smile, and from the time she could toddle around, she followed Priscilla everywhere, trying to hum along when her mother sang. Patrick aged but did so with grace, content in the knowledge that his farm would continue, that his daughter was happy, that his grandchildren would grow up knowing the land he had worked so hard to tame. Martha found new life in being a grandmother, doting on Thomas and Grace in ways she had never quite managed with her own children, the hardships of frontier life having left less room for softness back then. Gabriel and Patrick worked the farm together, gradually expanding their holdings as they saved money and bought adjacent parcels when they became available. Gabriel proved to have a head for business alongside his skill with manual labor, and the farm began to prosper in small but meaningful ways. Through it all, Priscilla continued to hum, while churning butter, while washing clothes, while tending the garden or rocking babies to sleep. Her hymns became the soundtrack of their lives, as essential as the wind in the pines or the rush of the creek in spring. One evening, when Thomas was 5 and Grace nearly 3, the family gathered on the porch as had become their habit. Patrick held Grace in his lap while she drowsed in the twilight. Martha sat mending by lamplight. Thomas played with carved wooden animals Gabriel had made for him. Gabriel sat on the steps as he always had, though now Priscilla sat beside him, her hand in his. "Sing something, Mama," Thomas requested, looking up from his toys. Priscilla exchanged a glance with Gabriel, who smiled encouragement. She began to sing, choosing it as well with my soul, her voice richer and deeper than it had been in her girlhood, but no less beautiful. Thomas abandoned his toys to lean against her knee, listening with the rapt attention only children can manage. Grace stirred in Patrick's lap, her eyes opening to find her mother's face. When the last note faded, Gabriel squeezed Priscilla's hand. "I asked you once if I could hear you hum forever," he said quietly. "I think this might be what forever feels like." "I think you might be right," she replied, resting her head on his shoulder. The years continued their march. Thomas grew tall and strong, helping his father and grandfather with the farm work. Grace inherited her mother's musical gift, her voice sweet and clear when she sang in church. More children came. Another son they named Patrick after his grandfather, and then a daughter called Martha for her grandmother. The little room off the main house grew too small, so Gabriel and Patrick built a separate cabin on the property, bigger and more comfortable, where the Zimmerman family could spread out. Patrick Dalton passed when Thomas was 12, dying peacefully in his sleep after a life well lived. They buried him on a hill overlooking the farm, where he could watch over the land he had loved. Martha followed 3 years later, weakened by pneumonia that she never quite recovered from. Their deaths were sorrows that the family bore together, drawing closer in their grief. But there were joys too, so many joys they sometimes felt overwhelming. Thomas courted and married a banker's daughter from our Ray, bringing her home to the farm where they built another house and started their own family. Grace met a young surveyor passing through and fell in love with the same sudden certainty that had struck her parents. They married and settled in town, where he established a practice while she taught piano to children. Through all of it, Gabriel and Priscilla remained at the heart of everything, their love the foundation on which the whole family was built. They aged together, gray creeping into their hair, lines deepening around their eyes, but their feelings for each other never diminished. If anything, they grew stronger, tested by time and proven true through decades of partnership. On their 25th wedding anniversary, their children and grandchildren gathered for a celebration. The farm had grown into a proper ranch by then, prosperous enough to employ several hands. The original farmhouse had been expanded and improved until it was almost unrecognizable from the small structure where Gabriel had first heard Priscilla humming. After the meal, after the toasts and the laughter, Gabriel stood and offered his hand to Priscilla. "Will you walk with me?" he asked, just as he had countless times before. She took his hand without hesitation, and they slipped away from the gathering, walking the familiar path to the creek. It was August again, warm and golden, the mountains purple against the evening sky. They sat on a fallen log they had claimed as their own years ago, watching the water tumble over smooth stones. "You remember the first time I heard you humming?" Gabriel asked. "How could I forget? You looked half dead from exhaustion, sitting on that horse like you might fall off at any moment." He laughed. "I felt half dead, but then I heard you, and it was like waking up from a long sleep, like everything before that moment had just been waiting for that one." "You asked if you could hear me hum forever," Priscilla recalled, leaning against his shoulder in the way that had become second nature over the decades. "And you've granted that wish every single day since. Do you know how rare that is? How blessed I am?" "We're both blessed," she corrected gently. "You gave me a life I never dared to dream of, love and family and a purpose beyond mere survival. You made everything bigger, Gabriel, everything more." He turned to kiss her forehead, a gesture so familiar and tender it made her eyes well with tears. "Hum something for me," he requested, as he had that very first morning. So she did, choosing the hymn that had become theirs over the years. Amazing Grace rose sweet and clear in the mountain air, her voice wavering slightly with age but losing none of its essential beauty. Gabriel closed his eyes and listened, just as he had the first time, and felt the same peace settle over him. When she finished, they sat in comfortable silence, watching the creek flow endlessly past, carrying pieces of their mountain down to distant oceans they would never see. Forever is turning out to be even better than I imagined, Gabriel said finally. It is, isn't it? Priscilla agreed, her hand finding his and squeezing gently. And we're not done yet. They were not. Years stretched ahead still. Years of watching grandchildren grow and great-grandchildren arrive. Years of sitting on the porch in the evenings, her humming the hymns while he listened with closed eyes and a grateful heart. Years of small kindnesses and deep affection, of weathering storms together and celebrating victories, of growing old side by side in the wild Colorado mountains they had made their home. On their 50th wedding anniversary, the family threw an even larger celebration. The ranch had grown into one of the most successful in the valley, though Thomas and his sons ran it now, Gabriel having officially retired from the heavy labor years back. But he still rose early every morning, still walked the property checking on things, still found reasons to be where Priscilla was. They were old now, truly old, their bodies showing the wear of hard-lived lives. But their eyes remained bright when they looked at each other, and their hands still sought each other out without conscious thought. At the party, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, someone called for Priscilla to sing. She protested that her voice was not what it once was, but the family insisted with the gentle persistence of those who know how precious each performance might be. Gabriel helped her stand, his arm around her waist, and they walked together to the center of the gathering. The crowd fell silent, 3 generations watching with love and respect. Priscilla took a breath, steadying herself, and began to sing. Her voice was thin now, wavering with age, but it still carried the essential sweetness that had captured a young cowboy's attention more than 50 years before. She sang Amazing Grace, the hymn that had bound them together, and Gabriel stood beside her with tears running unashamedly down his weathered face. When she reached the final verse, her voice faltered. Without hesitation, Gabriel joined her, his own voice rough but sincere, harmonizing in a way they had practiced over decades of singing together in church. Their voices twined together, imperfect but beautiful in their unity, carrying the words of grace and redemption out over the ranch they had built together. The last note faded into profound silence. Then the applause began, and the tears, and the embraces from family members who understood they had witnessed something sacred. That night, lying in their bed in the house Gabriel had built so many years ago, Priscilla nestled against her husband's chest, listening to his heartbeat steady and strong. "Gabriel," she whispered into the darkness, I want you to know something. Every single day we've had together has been a gift. Every morning I've hummed hymns for you. Every evening we've sat together watching the sunset. Every moment in between. All of it has been exactly what I would have chosen if I could have known that first morning what was coming. He tightened his arms around her, pressing a kiss to her silver hair. I feel the same way, my love. You've been my grace, my hymn, my everything. Will you promise me something, anything? When I'm gone, I want you to remember me humming. Not sad or grieving, just humming the way I did when we first met. Can you do that? Priscilla, he said, his voice catching. Let's not talk about that. We have to sometime. We're old, Gabriel. We've been blessed with so many years, but they won't last forever. He was quiet for a long moment, holding her close. All right, he said finally. I promise. But you have to promise me something too. What's that? Promise me that wherever we go after this life, you'll still be humming, that I'll still be able to find you by listening for those hymns. She smiled in the darkness, her hand coming up to rest over his heart. I promise. In this life and whatever comes after, you'll always be able to find me by my humming. They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other's arms, hearts beating in synchronized rhythm. two people who had loved well and lived fully in the Wild West they had made their home. The years that remained were gentler, filled with quiet joys rather than grand adventures. Gabriel and Priscilla spent their days in comfortable routine, sitting on the porch in good weather, walking slowly through the ranch observing the changes each season brought. They attended church every Sunday, sitting in the same pew they had occupied for decades, their voices joining in the hymns with the congregation. Priscilla continued to hum while she worked, though her work had grown lighter with age. She still churned butter sometimes, more from habit than necessity, the motion as familiar as breathing after so many years. And Gabriel still found reasons to be nearby when she did, still closed his eyes and listened like it was the first time. Thomas and his family visited often, as did Grace and her family, and the other children who had spread across Colorado but never forgotten their roots. The house was rarely empty, always filled with grandchildren seeking stories or great-grandchildren wanting to be held. Gabriel and Priscilla welcomed them all with open arms, their love multiplying with each new generation rather than diminishing. On a clear autumn morning, when the aspens had turned gold against the evergreens and the air held the first real bite of approaching winter, Priscilla sat on the porch with her old butter churn. She did not need to churn butter anymore, had not needed to for years, but sometimes she liked the familiar rhythm, the meditation of repetitive work. Gabriel sat on the steps nearby, supposedly mending a bridle but mostly just watching his wife with the same attention he had given her for more than 50 years. She began to hum, choosing Rock of Ages because it had always been one of his favorites, and he smiled. "You know what I was thinking about," he called to her. "What's that?" "That first morning I heard you. I was so tired, so lost. I had been drifting for months without purpose, working just to survive, not really living. Then I heard you humming and everything changed." My whole life changed in that moment. Priscilla stopped churning, looking at him with eyes that had grown softer with age but no less keen. "My life changed too. I didn't know it right away, but it did. You gave me everything I ever wanted without knowing I wanted it." "We were lucky," Gabriel said. "So many people go their whole lives without finding what we found. It wasn't just luck, it was grace. Amazing grace, just like the hymn says." He stood, crossing to her with the careful movements of old age, and held out his hand. She took it, letting him pull her gently to her feet. They stood there on the porch, holding each other in the golden autumn light, neither speaking because words were unnecessary after so many years together. "Hum something for me," Gabriel requested, as he had thousands of times before. So she did, choosing the hymn that had become their love song. Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound. She hummed it soft and low just for him, her head resting against his chest while he held her close. When she finished, he whispered against her hair, "I love you, Priscilla Zimmerman. I have loved you since the moment I heard you humming, and I will love you until my last breath and beyond." "I love you too, Gabriel, always and forever." They stood there a while longer, two old people who had loved well and lived fully, watching the mountains they had called home for more than half a century. The ranch spread out around them, prosperous and thriving, a testament to their years of hard work and dedication. But more than the land or the buildings or the material success, their true legacy was the love they had built and nurtured, the family they had raised, the example they had set of what it meant to choose each other every single day. That evening, the family gathered for Sunday supper as had become tradition. The big table was crowded with 3 generations, children laughing and talking over each other, the noise and chaos of a large, happy family. Gabriel and Priscilla sat at the head of the table, presiding over the gathering with quiet satisfaction. Before the meal, Gabriel asked Thomas to say grace. His son obliged, his voice deep and reverent as he thanked God for the food, for the family, for the blessings they had been given. When he finished, everyone chorused amen and reached for the bowls and platters. But before anyone could serve themselves, young Emma, Thomas's youngest grandchild and Priscilla's great-granddaughter, spoke up. She was 6 years old, blonde like Priscilla had been in her youth, with a sweet voice that promised to rival her great-grandmother someday. "Great-grandma, will you sing for us?" Emma asked. The table fell quiet, all eyes turning to Priscilla. She smiled at the little girl, seeing in her face echoes of her own youth, of her daughter Grace, of all the women in their line who had come before and would come after. "What would you like me to sing, sweetheart?" "Amazing Grace," Emma replied immediately. "It's my favorite." Of course it was. The hymn had become woven into their family story, inseparable from the history of how Gabriel and Priscilla had met and fallen in love. Everyone at the table knew the story, had heard it told and retold countless times. But nobody tired of hearing it, just as nobody tired of hearing Priscilla sing. She glanced at Gabriel, who nodded encouragement, his eyes suspiciously bright. Then she took a breath and began to sing. Her voice was frail now, that could not be denied, wavering and thin compared to the clear sweetness of her youth. But what it lacked in power it made up for in feeling, in the depth of emotion earned through a lifetime of faith and love. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost but now am found, was blind but now I see. The family joined her on the second verse, their voices blending in imperfect but heartfelt harmony. Thomas's deep bass, Grace's trained soprano, the children's eager if off-key contributions, and above it all, Gabriel's rough but sincere voice harmonizing with his wife's as he had for 50 years. When the last verse faded, little Emma clapped her hands with delight. "That was beautiful, great-grandma. Thank you, darling. Now let's eat before everything gets cold." The meal proceeded with warmth and laughter, the kind of gathering that makes life rich and meaningful. Gabriel and Priscilla did not say much, content to watch and listen as their family enjoyed each other's company. Their hands found each other under the table, fingers intertwining with the ease of long practice. After supper, as the sun set behind the mountains and painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, Gabriel and Priscilla walked slowly to their favorite spot by the creek. It had become their evening ritual in these later years, this quiet walk away from the bustle of family, this moment of peace where they could simply be together. They sat on their log, watching the water flow past in its eternal journey toward the distant sea. The air was cool, autumn giving way to winter, and Gabriel wrapped his coat around both of them, pulling Priscilla close against his side. "This has been a good life," she said softly, her head resting on his shoulder. "The best," he agreed. "I couldn't have imagined anything better if I had tried." "Do you ever think about that morning? The first time you heard me humming, all the time. I think about how close I came to riding past without stopping. I was tired enough that I almost did. But something made me pause, made me listen. I've thanked God for that moment every day since. I've thanked Him, too, for sending you to me, for giving us all these years, for every blessing we've received." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the creek and the fading light. The mountains stood eternal around them, witnesses to their love story, silent guardians of the valley they had called home for so long. "Priscilla," Gabriel said after a while, "I want you to know something." "What's that?" "If I could go back and live my life again, I wouldn't change a single thing. Not one moment. Every hardship, every struggle, every tear and every triumph, all of it led me to you and to this life we've built. I would do it all exactly the same." She turned to look at him, her eyes finding his in the twilight. "So would I, my love. So would I." He kissed her then, gentle and sweet, a kiss that held 50 years of love and devotion, of partnership and passion, of choosing each other every single day through all the seasons of life. When they finally walked back to the house, the stars had emerged in the darkening sky, sharp and brilliant in the thin mountain air. The windows of their home glowed warm with lamplight, and they could hear the faint sounds of their family still gathered inside, reluctant to end the evening. "We did good," Priscilla observed, looking at the house and everything it represented. "We did better than good," Gabriel replied. "We did extraordinary." The winter that followed was harder than usual. The snows came early and heavy, piling deep and lasting long. Gabriel developed a cough that lingered despite Martha's old remedies and the doctor's visits from town. Priscilla tended him faithfully, sitting by his bed and humming hymns while he dozed, her presence a comfort that no medicine could match. By spring, he had recovered enough to walk around the house and sit on the porch when the weather allowed. But he had aged significantly during his illness, and everyone could see that his time was growing short. He accepted this with the same quiet grace he had approached everything in life, more concerned about Priscilla and how she would manage without him than about his own mortality. "Promise me you'll keep singing," he told her one evening as they sat together watching the sunset. "Promise me you won't stop humming those hymns." "Why would I stop?" she asked, though tears gathered in her eyes because she knew why he was asking. "Because I won't be there to listen. But Priscilla, I need you to keep singing anyway. For yourself, for our family, because it's who you are." "Promise me." "I promise," she whispered, gripping his hand tightly. "But you're not leaving me yet. You're too stubborn for that." He smiled, a shadow of his younger grin but recognizable nonetheless. "I am stubborn. Stubborn enough to have stopped that morning to hear you hum, stubborn enough to stay and court you, stubborn enough to love you for 52 years and counting. But Priscilla, even stubborn men run out of time eventually." "Not yet," she said firmly. "Not yet, Gabriel Zimmerman. You promised to listen to me hum forever, and I'm holding you to that." "Forever doesn't mean what we thought it meant when we were young," he replied gently. "It means carrying each other in our hearts even when we're not physically together. It means the love lasting beyond the final breath." "I'll keep my promise, Priscilla. I'll listen to you hum forever, whether I'm sitting beside you or watching from whatever comes next." She wept then, allowing herself the tears she had been holding back, and he held her as best he could, murmuring comfort and love into her silver hair. But stubborn as he was, Gabriel rallied as spring turned to summer. He regained some strength, enough to walk around the ranch with Priscilla, to sit on the porch and watch the grandchildren play, to attend church on Sundays. The family breathed easier, hoping for more time, always more time. On a warm July evening, Gabriel and Priscilla celebrated their 52nd anniversary quietly, just the two of them. They walked to their spot by the creek, moving slowly but together, and sat on their log as the sun painted the sky gold and rose. 52 years, Gabriel marveled. "That's most of a lifetime." "It's a whole lifetime," Priscilla corrected. "The only lifetime that matters. Everything before you was just waiting." "Hum something for me," he requested. "One more time." So she hummed, choosing Amazing Grace because it was their song, the hymn that bound them together across the years. Her voice was thin and wavering, but she made it through all the verses, her hand gripping his tightly. When she finished, Gabriel turned to her with tears on his weathered face. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for every hymn, every song, every moment of beauty you've brought to my life." "Gabriel," she started, fear suddenly gripping her heart. "It's all right," he soothed. "I'm all right. I just wanted to make sure you knew how grateful I am, how blessed I've been, how much I love you." "I love you too," she replied, leaning against him as the creek sang its endless song and the mountains stood eternal watch. They sat there until full dark, neither wanting to break the moment, holding each other in the starlight. Gabriel passed peacefully 3 days later, in his sleep with Priscilla beside him as she had been for 52 years. His heart simply stopped, worn out from a long life fully lived. When she woke and realized he was gone, Priscilla felt as though part of her soul had been torn away. The family gathered for the funeral, coming from across Colorado and beyond to say goodbye to the patriarch of their clan. They buried him beside Patrick and Martha on the hill overlooking the ranch, with a simple stone marking his final resting place. At the graveside, Priscilla sang Amazing Grace one last time for her husband, her voice breaking but finishing strong, while 3 generations of family wept around her. The days after were dark and difficult. Priscilla moved through her life mechanically, doing what needed to be done but finding no joy in it. The house felt empty without Gabriel's presence, without his voice calling her name, without his footsteps on the porch. She could not bring herself to hum, the hymns dying in her throat before they could emerge. Thomas and his wife worried over her, as did Grace and the other children. They urged her to come stay with them, to not be alone in her grief. But Priscilla refused gently, insisting she needed to be in the house she had shared with Gabriel, surrounded by their memories. A month after the funeral, on an evening when the sunset painted the sky the same colors as her wedding day so long ago, Priscilla walked alone to the creek. She sat on their log, the wood worn smooth by years of shared evenings, and stared at the water flowing endlessly past. "I don't know how to do this without you," she whispered to the gathering dark. "I don't know how to be just me instead of us." The creek murmured its response, and the wind rustled through the pines, and somewhere in the gathering dusk, a mourning dove called its lonely song. Priscilla sat and listened, tears streaming down her face, feeling more alone than she had since she was 19 years old churning butter on a porch while an unknown future approached on a tired gray mare. Then, unbidden, a hymn rose in her memory. Not one she had chosen consciously, but one that came from somewhere deeper than thought. "It is well with my soul," the hymn she had sung that evening so many years ago when her children were small and the future seemed infinite. She began to hum it, hesitantly at first, then stronger as the familiar melody brought unexpected comfort. The notes carried across the water and up into the mountains, filling the silence with beauty and faith and the stubborn persistence of hope. When she finished, Priscilla felt something shift in her heart. The grief remained, would always remain, but alongside it came peace. Gabriel had asked her to keep singing, to keep humming, and now she understood why. Because the hymns were not just for him or even for herself. They were prayers made audible, connections to something greater than their love, as deep as it was. They were her grandmother's gift passed down, her legacy to pass forward. She stood, wrapping her shawl tighter against the evening chill, and walked back to the house. Tomorrow she would hum while she worked. Tomorrow she would sing at church if they asked. Tomorrow she would continue living the life she and Gabriel had built together, honoring his memory by not letting grief silence the music that had defined their love. The years that followed were gentler than Priscilla had feared. She did not remarry, never even considered it, content to live as Gabriel's widow and the matriarch of their growing family. She moved into Thomas's house eventually, giving up the cabin that held too many memories, but she remained active and engaged with life. She taught her great-grandchildren the hymns her grandmother had taught her, passing down the tradition to another generation. She attended every wedding and baptism, Every birthday and holiday gathering, her presence a living link to the ranch's history and the love story that had shaped it all. And she hummed. While working in the garden, while sewing quilts for new babies, while sitting on the porch watching the mountains, she hummed the hymns Gabriel had loved, sending her prayers and her love up into the heavens where she believed he waited for her. When people in town spoke of Priscilla Zimmerman, they spoke of her faith, her grace, her kindness, and always, always, they mentioned her humming. The woman who hummed hymns became part of our Ray's history, a living legend in her own time. She lived to be 87 years old, her mind sharp until the end, her voice still capable of carrying a tune even when her body had grown frail. On a spring morning in 1915, surrounded by family who loved her, Priscilla Dalton Zimmerman closed her eyes and did not open them again. At her funeral, the church was packed with family and friends, with people whose lives she had touched over 8 decades. The service was simple but beautiful, filled with the hymns she had loved. When the final hymn began, Amazing Grace sung by the whole congregation, there was not a dry eye in the building. They buried her beside Gabriel on the hill overlooking the ranch, their stones side by side, marking the resting place of 2 people who had loved well and lived fully in the wild Colorado mountains. The inscription on her stone reads simply, "She hummed hymns to the glory of God and the joy of all who knew her," but their story did not truly end there. It continued in their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who spread across Colorado and beyond, carrying forward the legacy of faith and love that Gabriel and Priscilla had established. It continued in the ranch that still bore their name, prosperous and thriving into the 20th century. It continued in the stories told and retold at family gatherings, the tale of the cowboy who stopped to listen to a farm girl humming and asked to hear her forever. And sometimes, on quiet mornings when the light slants golden across the valley, and the wind carries the scent of pine and meadow grass, people swear they can hear it still. A woman's voice humming hymns, sweet and pure and eternal, rising up from the land she loved toward the mountains that stand forever. And if you listen very carefully, you might hear beneath it the sound of a man listening with his whole heart, keeping his promise to hear her hum forever. The ranch remained in the family for generations, each one adding their own stories to the foundation Gabriel and Priscilla had laid. Thomas ran it until his own sons were old enough to take over, and they in turn passed it to their children. The original farmhouse became a historical landmark, preserved carefully with the old butter churn still sitting on the porch, a testament to where it all began. The small cemetery on the hill grew over the years, adding new stones as family members completed their journeys and returned to rest in the land they had loved. But Gabriel and Priscilla's stones remained at the heart of it all, their names weathered by wind and snow but still legible, still telling the story of 2 people whose love had shaped everything that came after. In our Ray, the story became part of local lore. The tale of the farm girl and the cowboy, of hymns hummed while churning butter, of love that lasted 52 years and beyond. Parents told it to their children, teachers shared it in schools, and historians included it in books about frontier Colorado. It became one of those rare true stories that felt like fairy tale, proving that even in the hard-scrabble reality of the American West, love could flourish and last. The final chapter of their story was written not by them, but by their great-great-granddaughter, who in 1982 marked the centennial of their meeting by commissioning a bronze plaque to be placed at the entrance to what had become Zimmerman Ranch. It read, "On this land in 1882, Gabriel Zimmerman heard Priscilla Dalton humming hymns while churning butter. He stopped to listen and asked to hear her hum forever. Their love, built on faith and hard work, created a legacy that endures through 5 generations and counting. May all who enter here remember that the most important things in life are faith, family, and love that lasts forever. The dedication ceremony drew hundreds of people, Zimmerman descendants from across the country returning to honor the couple who had started it all. They sang Amazing Grace together, dozens of voices blending in imperfect harmony, and those who had known Priscilla in her final years swore they could almost hear her voice among them, sweet and clear and eternal. And so the story ends where it began, in the mountains of Colorado, where love proved as enduring as the stone peaks. Gabriel Zimmerman kept his promise, listening to Priscilla hum for 52 years in this life, and continuing beyond into whatever comes after. And Priscilla kept hers, never stopping her hymns, passing them down through the generations until they became part of the land itself. Theirs was a love story for the ages, played out against the backdrop of America's frontier, proving that in any time and any place, when two hearts find each other and hold fast, they can build something that lasts forever. The Farmgirl hummed hymns while churning butter. The cowboy listened and asked to hear her hum forever. And in the end, forever was exactly what they got, their love echoing through time itself, as enduring as the mountains and as eternal as the hymns that first brought them together.